Well, good evening. I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So with that, I welcome you. And please join us every Monday evening at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. If you missed last week's episode with Edwige Junta and Richard Rabinowitz, you can go to Birds Books Write America page and link to the episodes easily. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch on our Write America YouTube channel. We're now hosting all of our episodes on Zoom, so all the recordings will reside on YouTube. All the earlier episodes 1 through 32 are there already, and we will place this one there tonight while I continue to move the rest over. Tonight, Birds Books hosts readings by and conversation with Rose Styron, Edward Hirsch, and Elizabeth Hawes Weinstock. We'll return at the end after the readings and discussion to bring your questions and comments to the authors. During the episode, please feel free to make comments or ask questions in the chat. We do ask that you remain muted, however. Our first speaker is Rose Styron. Rose Styron is the author of 4 poetry collections: Fierce Day by Vineyard Light, Thieves' Afternoon, and From Summer to Summer. She has written introductions to Letters to My Father, and a collection of letters written by her husband, the Pulitzer Prize writer William Styron, and to his father in the Second Letters of William Styron, which she edited. Her latest book, Beyond This Harbor: Adventurous Tales of Heart and Home, will be released in April 2023 by Canal. Also a human rights activist, Styron has traveled widely for Amnesty International and other human rights organizations. She lives on Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Please welcome to the screen, Rose Styron. Let me grab you. Hello.
I'm delighted to be here. I woke up this sunny late September morning on my island of Martha's Vineyard, humming September song. It's a long, long way from June to September. And I thought how lucky I was not to awake in Ukraine or Russia or Venezuela or even Florida today with Hurricane Ian. I'll set the scene from my porch here. It's late September, no more round the island boat races or children clamoring to learn to sail next door. A lone white sail and a ferry still gracing the autumn waters I will soon stop swimming in, but not stop blessing. I recall a poem I wrote in my book by Vineyard Light in the 90s, which begins, September and the Shenandoah fantasy of brigandines sails to windward grandly down the real horizon, points her prow and disappears. In Vineyard Haven, we, bereft on docks and lawns, dream a last voyage, watch her go, taking summer with her now. I thought too, as I sought the taste of some autumn berries, of a poem by my dear old friend Galway Canal, picking blackberries in late September. It made me think back to being a little girl in World War II, being sent off to camp in Maine, where we were directed to pick blueberries for the war effort. I delighted in tasting a lot of the soldiers' promised fare, if that's what the director meant by war effort. I guess having just turned in my memoir, I keep looking back and harking to childhood pleasures like that one. So here's Blackberries by Galway Canal. I love to go out in late September among the fat, overripe, icy blackberries, to eat blackberries for breakfast. The stalks very prickly, a penalty they earn for knowing the black art of blackberry making. And as I stand among them, lifting the stalks to my mouth, the ripest berries fall almost unbidden to my tongue, as words sometimes do, certain peculiar words like strengths or squinched, many-lettered one-syllable lumps, which I squeeze, squinch, open, and splurge well in the silence, startled, icy, black language of blackberry eating in late September. This week, my lawn has been graced by phalanxes of bright dragonflies and noisy crickets and battalions of crows in my tall crabapple tree. They made me think of an Emily Dickinson poem I'll quote. September Baccalaureate. I'll start again. September Baccalaureate. A combination is of crickets, crows, and retrospects, and a dissembling breeze that hints without assuming an innuendo seer that makes the heart put up its fun and turn philosopher. Philosopher I'm not. My September world returns to worry over Putin, Trump, climate's guns, prison, group violence, immorality, and bad court ruling, poverty, and plagues continuing in our challenging democracy. But nature's ever-present beauty, plus so many remarkable friends to share it, brings back part of my old Pollyanna soul. I looked back at my first book of poems for young people, From Summer to Summer, published in 1965. So many voices contemplating, oh gosh, long page, contemplating their September changing lives. It was written before my 60s public life even began, and not during cherished evenings with Bill Styron, for sure. One more old September poem, mine from romantic September days, Boone, rural Connecticut. I'll read half of. It's called Myopia. Being nearsighted has its rewards. From my window, the tall farmer squinting at sunset over his dry fall wheat fields is you. The jaunty bill collector striding up Ruckham Hill, humming through the morning mist, I welcome you. The secret tennis star, smashing his serves into false courts, who twists and to feminine applause, which he deserves as I arrive. The blue chip man in the suit, alive and rounding Fifth Avenue at a fast clip. The sun-turned scholar stretching among admirers on the beach. My landing startles me. I knew it all along, you. My fields blossom in September. The world's lottery is mine to win. My opponents are demolished in games they won't even remember. New York isn't dirty or boring. Airports and audiences don't scare me. Adoring. I'm a woman, and this season I'm in. Life quickens constantly for me. I am ready noon and night to draw my pen, my swords. As long as I sense you near, being nearsighted has its rewards. Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you so much, Rose. Our next speaker is Edward Hirsch. Edward Hirsch, a MacArthur Fellow, has published 10 books of poems, most recently Gabriel, a poem, and A Stranger by Night. He has also published 6 books of prose about poetry, including 100 Poems to Break Your Heart in 2021 and The Heart of American Poetry in 2022, and has received numerous awards and fellowships, including a MacArthur Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Rome Prize, the Pablo Neruda Presidential Medal of Honor, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature. He serves as president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and lives in Brooklyn. Please welcome to the screen, Edward Hirsch. Let me find you there, Ed. There you are.
Hey, Alice. Thank you for that lovely reading, Rose. Why are bill collectors always so jaunty? They always look so happy when they're coming to collect. I'm going to read you a few poems from my book-length poem for my son, Gabriel. It's all one, but I just wanted to get a sense of him. And then a few poems from Stranger by Night. Mr. Impulsive walked out of class when he did not like what the teacher said. It was boring. Mr. Impulsive scurried out in a storm wearing shorts and a wife beater. Soon he was shivering. The neighbors complained to the landlord, complained to me, but Mr. Impulsive could not be bothered to close the gate. Mr. Impulsive left the house without his keys. I don't know how many times he camped out on the front stoop. One night he convinced a neighbor to shimmy the lock with a credit card. He was never locked out again. Mr. Impulsive will not be sleeping at home. He'd rather stay out and crash wherever he finds himself at 5 a.m. He could be oddly well-mannered to the parents of his friends. He was usually welcome. From the notebook of Mr. Impulsive, it is better to sneak through a side door than to wait in line like a sucker. It is not necessary to get directions. It's much better to head out right now. Time doesn't matter. These were the antics of Mr. Impulsive, who never knew where he was going until he got there. From the storybook of bluster and bad judgment, from the annals of loneliness, from the history of kids he met on the street in special programs, it was dangerous to stay in Amherst. Lord of misadventure, I'm scared of rounding him up and turning him into a story. God of scribbles and erasures, I hope he shines through like a Giacometti portrait. I keep scraping the canvas and painting him over again, but he keeps slipping away. He was like a spider preyed on by other spiders and older insects. Sweet venom, his arrivals were swift and his departures sudden. I couldn't understand how he lifted the shower door right off its hinges. When Gabriel cooked, the flames rose too high and the fire alarm sounded. When the fire alarm sounded, he tore it off the wall and left the wires dangling. We took him to Arlington Park Racetrack, but they wouldn't let him in the clubhouse because he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He disappeared, and in 10 minutes, he came back wearing a button-down, a tie, and a blue blazer. He stopped by with a dozen incense candles. You don't even like incense, Lori said. It didn't matter. He had gotten them for free. He bought 10 cheeseburgers for $10 on the dollar menu at McDonald's and threw 6 of them away. He brought a 6-pack of beer into the common room of the nursing home to watch a football game with my mother, because everyone needs a good beer, especially the guy on the ventilator and the nurses who work too hard. He said the countryside made him feel nervous. He wanted a 24-hour kind of city. He woke me up at 2 a.m. to take a walk. He needed to talk. Lori pulled me back into bed. He had flat feet and an awkward gait. He didn't like to dance. He liked to go to raves and chill with friends. He couldn't pay attention, but his meds made him feel sleepy, and he sold them to college kids. He liked to kick back and remember the time we were riding home in a taxi cab on the West Side Highway, and my mother offered to take him to a strip club for his 21st birthday. What's wrong with that, she wanted to know. Why they couldn't celebrate together. That's just what you want, he bellowed, going for a lap dance with grandma. He liked to kick back and declare he wanted to track down his birth mother to see if he really had Celtic blood. He liked to kick back and tell my family about the time he saw an American Hasidic Jewish reggae musician at Hampshire College. He saw Nicolas Cage going up an escalator in a movie theater and turned to his friends. I hate Nicolas Cage. He has such a big head. He liked to kick back and tell us how much he liked weed and shrooms. How bad could it be for you, he said. It comes out of the ground. He liked to kick back and roll a spliff with his friends at night. He always liked to go higher and higher. We're here, he'd say, lifting his hand to the middle of his chest. But we need to go here, he continued on, and raised his hand up to his neck. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves, though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief. I am not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. My friends don't get buried. My friends don't get buried in cemeteries anymore. Their wives can't stand the sadness of funerals, the spectacle of wreaths and prayers, tear-soaked speeches delivered from the altar, all those lies and encomiums, the suffocating smell of flowers filling everything. No more undertakers in black suits clutching handkerchiefs. Old buddies weeping in corners, telling off-color stories, nipping shots. No more covered mirrors, black dresses, skull caps and crucifixes. Sometimes it takes me a year or two to get out to the backyard in Sheffield or Fresno. Those tall ashes scattered under a tree somewhere in a park, somewhere in New Jersey. I'm a delinquent mourner stepping on pine cones, forgetting to pray. But the mourning goes on anyway, because my friends keep dying without a schedule, without even a funeral, while the silence drums us from the other side. The suffocating smell of flowers fills everything, always. The darkness grows warmer, then colder. I just have to lie down on the grass and press my mouth to the earth to call them, so they would answer. The Guild. Goodbye to the years we spent leaning over badly typed poems and cramped studies and dank hotel rooms, half crazed, inconsolable, constantly jabbing pencils at each other, brooding, smoking on the balcony across from a temple on the other side of the river, one night in Rome, loyal or disloyal to the old gods, our flawed mentors, our weakness for standing at the podium seeking applause, slashing lines, reciting Blake or Yeats, giving up sleep for late night sessions listening to Coltrane, and gossiping about new books and poets who've been dead for centuries, facing each other knee to knee, or sitting side by side over each fresh draft, furiously arguing about this enjambment or that illusions, mysteries of the craft, the muse, our shoulders touching, our voices growing hoarse with laughter, or walking out to the pier a few yards from the sea so that we could stand there together under the stars, alone with the abyss. A baker swept by. You were already losing your eyesight last winter in Rome when you paused in the doorway at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning and a baker swept by on a shiny bicycle, waving a cap and singing under his breath. You didn't know bakers wore white aprons dusted with flour and floated around the city like angels on a freshly baked day. You weren't sure why morning halted up and down the street as you stood in the doorway and a baker winged by on a weekend morning so new and pristine that you looked into the sky and for one undiminished instant of misplaced time, you saw brightness everywhere before a shadow crossed the rooftops and it was blotted out. And I'm going to close with a poem called Don't Write Elegies. I think it's funny since I spent so much of my life writing elegies. Don't write elegies anymore. Let someone else stumble past the mausoleum and grieve under the calm shade of a plane tree, wiping away the tears of his ex-wife, staining the knees of his black suit, first sobbing, then choking back sobs, comforting others, consoling himself by scrubbing the white stone and weeding the plot year after year. I'm sorry, it's too sad. It's time for someone else to mourn my dead. Though who else can do it? I just need to lie here a while longer, face down in the soil, and then get up and breathe. Thank you.
Ed, thank you so much.
Thanks, Alice.
Our next speaker, Elizabeth Hawes Weinstock. Elizabeth Hawes Weinstock is an American writer of biography, journalism, and creative nonfiction. Her first book, New York, New York, How the Apartment House Transformed the Life of the City, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and named a New York Times Book of the Year. Her biography / memoir, Camus, a Romance, chronicles the life of Nobel Prize winning French-Algerian writer Albert Camus, along with her own experience trying to follow in his footsteps. It was the subject of both the Center for Fiction event and a joint Penn Center for Transformative Lives event at New York University. Betsy is a former member of the editorial staff at The New Yorker and has written numerous articles for the magazine. She has also contributed essays and reviews to the New York Times Magazine and Book Review, The Nation, Vogue, Gourmet, Mirabella, and Martha's Vineyard Magazine. She serves on the board of directors of the Martha's Vineyard Museum. She is married to Hawes Weinstock, and they have 3 children and live in New York City on Martha's Vineyard. Please welcome to the screen, Betsy Hawes Weinstock. Let me snag you here, Betsy.
Thank you.
Sure.
You got all those names in.
I tried.
Tonight, I am going to read a few excerpts from my first book, which you rattled off, New York, New York, How the Apartment House Changed the Life of the City, 1869 to 1930, which began as a reporter piece for the New Yorker and then was published as a book in 93 by Canal. It told the story of how New York City changed from a town of private house dwellers in the Civil War days to the great metropolis of the Roaring 20s and the Art Deco 30s, when over 98% of the population had become apartment house dwellers. By then, the apartment, which began as an awkward imitation of a private house, had slowly emerged as a genre of its own, changing lives, values, and social behavior. This had taken a mere 60 years. This was my introduction to this story in that book. When the first apartment house was built in New York City, it was as out of place on the streets as a visitor from another country or century. The year was 1869, and the idea of sharing a roof or a front door or a staircase with other families was both exotic and shocking. Frenchmen or Romans or socialists might have found it acceptable to cohabit in large buildings, but New Yorkers, particularly well-to-do New Yorkers, associated the term with tenements and had good reason to demand the privacy, security, and respectability that came with their own address. This first apartment building, located on East 18th Street, was named the Stuyvesant, after the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, as the site was once a field in his colonial farmhouse stead. And it was financed by a descendant, also named Stuyvesant, who admired French apartment houses and thought that it was time that New York had one. It was 5 stories tall, with discreet decoration that made it look like a row of private houses. And cannily, it had been sited near busy Union Square, where there already were signs of change, a boarding house, a few hotels, and a handful of popular theaters. There were other early efforts, other French flats, as the Stuyvesant was called, studio apartments intended for artists, bachelor apartments, cooperative apartments that were inspired by New York's forward-looking centennial in 1876. Perhaps the best and shortest lived of the cooperative buildings was the so-called Hubert Home Clubs. The name expressed the time. They could have come out of the Centennial or one of the house beautification books, or the head of an urban visionary. Hubert, or Hubert, was the architect Philip G. Hubert, who was a Frenchman. Home, with the intimation of permanence, was for reassurance. Club was an effort and an invitation to elitists of the day. Hubert, or Hubert, the head of the firm H. Pearson and Company, was a utopianist, a proselytizer, and a reformer, and he proposed sharing far more than the controversial common roof. He recognized the cooperative scheme as an opportunity to create increasingly large and extravagant buildings. Knowing well the upper classes, he built tall and grand buildings, newfangled incinerators, cold air boxes, and bootblacking services, as well as being comfortable, efficient, and innovational. Such luxurious quarters that some critics feared that they looked like a socialist dream. Hubert looked forward to a new, improved era of human society, and he stirred up intellectual hopes. His buildings were popular and for a while profitable too. The only Hubert building to endure, however, was the Chelsea, which is still there on West 23rd Street, and offered a variety of accommodations that was unique in the city. Duplex apartments attached to the roof garden for artists, private dining rooms that came with a French chef. Of all the ideas about housing stirring in the city in the 1880s, however, the most spectacular were the mansions being built for the Vanderbilts, Tiffany's, Villards, and a new class of millionaires. They looked like chateaus and villas and Renaissance piles, and they were unlike anything Americans had ever called home before. They became the emblems of the heady Gilded Age that was dawning, and quite surprisingly, they had a direct effect on the shape of apartment houses too. The Dakota, rising in the elegant splendor of the as yet undeveloped Upper West Side, was the first and most famous of the colossal new multiple dwellings to come, and a daring venture to risk. Its cost would put it in the same category as the Plaza Hotel in St. Patrick's Cathedral that year. Its builder, Edward Clark, head of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, would say about it, "There are few persons who are princely enough to wish to occupy an entire palace, but there are many who would like to occupy a portion of a great building, which would be more perfect in its arrangement than any palace in Europe." Over the next decades, on the lonely, undeveloped Upper West Side, the noble Dakota would be followed by the Osborne, the Ansonia, the Apthorpe, the Belnor, and a dozen of so-called communal palaces. But on the still sacrosanct united Upper East Side, the parade of single homes on Fifth Avenue was not broken up until 1911, when at 998 Fifth, a 12-story full-scale neo-Italian Renaissance palazzo took its place beside a 5-story Beaux-Arts mansion. As it was said, the conversion of the rich had begun. While the tide did not turn overnight to apartment house living, it turned methodically over the decade, with each new apartment house that appeared, 3 on Park, 2 on Fifth, another couple on Park, built a new landscape that after the First World War suddenly looked like the real Upper East Side. During the 1920s, the rambunctious time that F. Scott Fitzgerald named the Jazz Age, the city saw the biggest building boom in the history of it, the city. New buildings appeared every 51 minutes. Old buildings came down at an equal dramatic rate. The population of the city was almost 6 million and growing. The Majestic, a new luxury apartment on Central Park West, was still in construction, planned with a sleek New World facade, twin towers, and a lavish Old World interior of 11 to 14 apartment rooms. In 1929, when the stock market fell, its architects frantically reworked the building into 3 to 11-room units with inventive and much less elaborate floor plans. Ironically, their designs for sunken floors, efficiency kitchens, and dining alcoves looked like important new ideas for apartments for the affluent, meant to activate a gracious but simpler life within the boundaries of conventional conduct, but freed of ceremonial clutter. The luxury apartment, the floor plan said, was not a closed and comprehensive environment, but a sensible foothold in a more exciting one. Luxury was not sheer excess or outdated ritual, but coherent and useful for form, sunlight, and perspective on the world outside. The great era of the luxury apartment building ends here, with the apartment house emerging as a genre of its own, with virtues of its own. For a while in the 30s, a handful of sumptuous old-style apartment houses continued to appear, as if to express confidence in the way things were. Such buildings were referred to as throwbacks, as they are now. The apartment house continues to evolve, as does New York's streetscape. As Edith Wharton warned in The Age of Innocence over a century ago, the compact world of my youth has receded into a past from which it can only be dug up in bits by the assiduous relic hunter, and its smallest pieces begin to be worth collecting before the last of those who knew the live structure are swept away with it. In my book, I finished up that introduction with the following. I can read it in the growing dark of my study. It is a long way back to the early days when the apartment house represented an incongruous idea, or even in the later ones when it was a Hollywood fantasy. Nostalgia is inevitable, for New York was young and innocent then, and it is thoroughly and matter-of-factly apartmentalized now. The opulence that once served to define a luxury apartment, to give it credibility, and respectability, is a virtual impossibility. The size of a typical well-bred apartment has shrunk to a sliver of its former self. And like apartment dwellings, apartment dwellers have changed dramatically. A century ago, they were inexperienced and wary. The conversion to gregarious living was like a process of maturation, slow and uneven, full of resistance and distractions, until, in the end, as the idea of modernity took hold, it was sweeping, like a change of heart. Thank you, and thank the two poets that preceded me, which is wonderful company. I'll take it anytime. Is it up to us now, guys? I think it is.
Yes,
Loved it,
ma'am.
Betsy. Loved it, Betsy. Thank you so much. It's right in plain sight. You just discovered it. It's amazing.
Well, it's like so many events, so many developments, so many, you name it. It's a bunch of stories, and one thing melds into the next, and suddenly we mentioned the importance of poetry and fiction. Well, I mean, somewhat ironically, but notably, it was when people were beginning to write novels about New York and poetry about New York in the 1880s and 90s, and it was in the theater that people began to pay a different sort of attention to it.
They realized it was a subject matter.
Yes. Yes, certainly. And then began to treat it as such. And then it combined with other influences. It became, one of the things that changed as I first wrote this piece about this, and I thought for the New Yorker, and I thought I had written everything I knew. And then somebody was interested in a book, and she asked me how long I'd write. It was actually Rose's editor at Canal. Now, and she asked me how long I wanted to, write a little more. And I said, oh, I don't know, 6 months. She said, 6 months? What? I said, well, okay, a year. Well, 5 years later, I finished the book because I had not overlooked, I had not yet encountered the law called the tenement law that allowed buildings to grow much taller. Because in this intermediate space between when the apartment house began to be built, and particularly the Dakota on the Upper West Side, they were limited in height. And suddenly they could be 10 stories and 12 stories, and began to look much more European, and classicism came in, and statues cropped up in the city, and et cetera, et cetera. But it is a very good story. And your stories about your son, particularly, are
Oh.
wonderful.
I so wish I'd known your son.
You're still,
I like telling the funny parts about it. Because I tried hard to make him come alive as a person.
you do. His antics and his sleeping elsewhere.
It's what you're trying to do when you're writing about people. You're aware that, well, we're of a certain age that a lot of people, we've all lost a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's, to me, it's a little unbearable. And so you try to do the best you can to bring back some part of them so that they can live. I mean, look, Rose's effort with Bill's letters is to let Bill live in his voice in those correspondences.
Mm.
Read those, and my last book, Fierce Day, is just grief over losing him, but seeing him everywhere and making that better for me.
I don't know how you feel, but Betsy and Rose, but I don't know, when I'm writing about someone, it doesn't bring them back, but I feel that I'm with them. It doesn't solve life's problems. I mean, when you're done, they're still not there.
Yeah.
But when you are writing about them, feel like you're with them a bit.
I think that's so true. I always feel that when I write about either Bill or my friends who died. There are so many of them, it keeps happening more and more, of course.
Well, in the course of writing my biography, or sort of a hybrid biography of Albert Camus, I, of course, did not know him. I had never met him. He actually died when I was in college. And I had written a thesis on him in college. And then I went to France for quite a while. But, you spend a huge amount of time trying to predict what he's going to do, to judge responses to events, getting to know the friends, and it becomes hugely intimate.
And personal, I'm sure. I would love to spend time with Camus. I'm so glad you didn't write that book about Sartre.
Well, the timing was very good because Sartre, of course, was kingpin during the 60s, when his Stalinism and everything else was absolutely in vogue.
Unbearable. Yeah.
And he was the Pope. He was called the Pope of the time. And Camus was totally out of favor. Not only had he died, but he died at the height of unpopularity because of his feelings about Algeria and that it should be a federalistic republic. And we should not let it go. It should be populated by several nationalities. And his feelings about Stalin and Stalinism. And then he won the Nobel Prize, which in France, certainly the intellectuals considered to be just only the forgotten win something like Pulitzer Prize. They're done with. And he was criticized during that time, particularly harshly, for his opinions on Algeria and on some remarks he had made about wanting to protect his mother, who still lived in Algeria, whatever. And then they found papers that had been in the accident. He died in a car accident for what was going to be a novel, and a very long novel. And it was then published. The daughter didn't know whether to do it or not, but it was published, and it was a huge success. And it was a bit like an autobiography because he hadn't gotten a chance to make it fiction. It was an autobiography. So suddenly there's this, and suddenly the Soviet Union has melted away, and the world has changed, and Camus is on the top of the heap still. He's very popular. And he's quite easy to think very highly of.
He's a wonderful person
Mm.
and writer.
And it's on.
And it's unbearable that Sartre took the day, but you had your revenge.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
I'd love to hear about your new book, what you're working on now.
Me?
No, Ed.
Ed, yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Oh, you mean, are you talking about the heart of American poetry?
Yes.
Which I have to say, I have right here.
Whoa, thank you. I'm glad I tipped you.
Yep.
Well, it was the book club that said, and we were having a poetry month. And a very wise member said, if you're looking for something to read, it's just a wonderful read or a handbook or whatever you want, get this. And not everybody bought it because they didn't, because they had another book to read that month as well. And I'm so grateful for it.
Thank you. What you were saying about Camus is the way I felt about writing that book about American poetry, that because we were so isolated during the pandemic, I cheered myself up by being with these American poets, most of them who are not alive. But being in their presence and thinking about the work and thinking about the contribution that they made to the American Poetry Project and to the American Cultural Project was meaningful to me. And it gave me the chance to think about, well, I mean, I wrote the book in the light of 3 viruses: the virus COVID-19, the virus of systemic racism, which shocked me in its reemergence, and the sustained authoritarian threat to democracy, which I never had experienced. I thought democracy was more solid than it turns out to be. And I wanted to think about what American poetry had to contribute to that conversation. And it really kept me grounded and really helped me think. And I'll just say 2 things about it. One of the poems, the 2 poems that they're in my introduction that will make the case. One is Walt Whitman's poem, I Hear America Singing. And I argue that in that poem, no one ever stood at ground level before the way Whitman did. No one actually heard the democratic chorus, not even Wordsworth, of ordinary people singing. But there's a promise in that poem that all people are created equal and that all laborers matter and that everyone counts. And we know that's not true in America, that hasn't worked. And so in the early 1920s, Langston Hughes, who was down and out in Genoa, wrote a poem called I Too. And the poem is, I Too Sing America. Now, interesting, when I taught that poem to high school kids, they all know that poem, but they don't know it has anything to do with Whitman.
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful story to be.
It's a revision of Whitman. And then the other part of it, and I'll just finish with this, is that Langston Hughes says, I'm the darker brother. He doesn't say I'm your enemy. He doesn't say I don't have anything to do with you. He doesn't say I'm an expatriate. He says I'm the darker brother, which gave me the idea that American poetry is a family. It's a sometimes contentious family. There are a lot of arguments in the family. Sometimes people go storming off in different directions. I told that to my sister and she said, I wonder where you got that idea about a family gathering. But this is the idea that we're all part of the family and that you're not born into that family in literature. You have to write your way into it by eloquence. And this idea of a contentious family holding each other to account about justice and equality and literary values seemed heartening to me. And it seemed to me something that is part of the democratic project. And because I believe that American poetry is an underutilized resource in American culture, it cheered me up to try and make the case. So that's what I was doing. I mean, it's a reading, Rose, of 40 American poems, beginning with Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley, and going to Garrett Hongo and Joy Harjo. But it's also a reconsideration of democratic values. And I know those, given your tremendous work in activism, I know that those values are important to you.
You mentioned the fluctuation of poetry. I think you talk about the songbook of poetry has so many fluctuations. how do you see this period now? I mean, it feels as if poetry is everywhere, which is wonderful. And that, as you also quote Rilke saying, that poetry is thought of as, this is my words, not his, but the idea was that, in fact, it's thought of as emotional expression, and it, in fact, is an expression of experience, which I thought.
You're totally on that. I agree. Most people undervalue poetry by just think that it's emotional. But Rilke makes the argument that a poem is an experience. I love that idea because it comes out of the life lived and the full life. It's really hard to talk about the contemporary moment because we're so in it. But I would say the most heartening thing about it is that a lot of people who felt they never had a place at the table now find that they're invited in. It doesn't mean the challenges are over. It doesn't mean we're done. But the idea is that everyone is welcomed into the house, and there's a big fight going on about it around identity. But the basic value that people were excluded are no longer excluded. That doesn't going to tell us who everyone's going to read in 10 years or 20 years. Unlike my students, I like the poetry of the past. I don't only like the poetry of the present. I believe, as Pound said, all poets are contemporaneous. It's not only things that were written this morning. But in essence, the democratic project is like everyone's coming in. And I just think that's really heartening, cacophonous moment.
Well, I think it's so important that you've done this because people of my age and upbringing knew everything about English poetry and Irish poetry and a lot about French and Italian and Polish poetry and Latin American poetry and very little about American poetry. So I think this is just terribly important for everyone growing up now.
Turns out that American poetry is like America, it's an experiment and a fairly recent invention. And that we've had to figure out what it was. But one of the things that really that seems true to me is that when you rethink the history of America in light of what we now know, if you think about indigenous peoples and the importation against their will of people from Africa and servitude and slavery, these are filters going into the American story. It's not all what Emerson called the optative mood. That was all American poetry and American cultures has always been shadowed by a darker trauma and tragedy. And that's actually been part of the story, even though official narratives try and iron it out and make it seem simpler. And I believe the canonical view of a lot of our poets normalizes them. It's a much stranger bunch than one might think. But there's a real reason why we normalize Robert Frost or Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman or Ralph Waldo Emerson, because it tells us a story that we want to hear about ourselves. But the actual story is much darker and much more difficult and much more traumatic. The real Whitman has a much darker side. The Emerson is much more unruly than one might think. And the other thing I would just say about this is that I was really struck rereading and thinking through American culture, how often people use the word we instead of just the word I. When you think of like Emerson's battle cry, why should not we also have an original religion and not be subject to theirs? He doesn't say, why should not I have an original religion? Why should not we? And I'm very struck by how often the American conversation is between a kind of conversation argument between the self and the community, the I of the individualism and the rule of the polis. And if, as Emerson says, life is an ecstasy, then it has to be an ecstasy for all. And I think that's the project. I think the project is making room for everyone in the voice. So you have a Walt Whitman, but you also have an Emily Dickinson, who we now know as an extremely radical poet. But how is she becoming a radical poet? She's undermining the communal hymn structure. She's fracturing it. She's taking the common values of the hymn and remaking them for a poetry of individual salvation. Well, that's a very radical thing to do, but it's an individual in conversation with the community. And time and again, I cheered myself up during the pandemic, and cheering myself up talking to you about this conversation that takes place in American literature, not just in poetry, between the I and the civis, the civic values. When Whitman says oneself I sing, he then immediately, oneself I sing, a simple separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. As soon as he says he's separate, he starts talking about democracy and and literally in a mass. So anyway, I find this interesting to think about in terms of our literature, and it makes me feel that those of us who are literary have something to contribute into the idea of a fairer and more just America.
Well, I'm really, really interested in this. I'm at the moment reading Jory Graham's new book.
Oh, I was thinking of mentioning her. Go ahead.
It's just extraordinary. To the last be human. And I'm not going to describe it, but I am sure that you've included that, or at least Jory and her earlier works in your book. I'm very, very curious about that.
She's in the conversation.
Good.
And she's been, as you know, she's been way out ahead on the values about climate change.
Exactly. I know
And
that.
starting with sea change, she was she saw it.
She
was like Cassandra. She was like Cassandra in the wilderness.
Yes, she is.
That is Sandra. Thank heaven she lives on the vineyard to be my close friend and to tell me what I should know and when it's going to happen.
Very angry. Sell your house one night at midnight. Whatever. I was curious about, at one point you mentioned the remarkable fact that I think there were four, and I'm going to miss one of them now, but there were four poets that suddenly showed up with these very strong voices. Thoreau, Emerson, Melville, who am I missing? Whitman's too late, in the 1850s.
Yeah, I mean, I was remembering that when I was in college, I read F.O. Matheson's book, American Renaissance.
Right.
And between 1850 and 1855, 5 writers, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman, all found their voices. And that 4 of them, not Hawthorne, but 4 of the other 4 all considered themselves poets. I mean, it's an incredible moment for the liberation of an original American literature. 5 years. And then later, I would just add in 1862, 63, Emily Dickinson wrote her greatest poems.
Oh.
She wrote like 750 to 1,000 poems in the middle of the Civil War. And so I just add a 6th there, that in this very short period, American literature really came of age.
Do you see that they spoke to each other in one way or another?
You mean person?
No, I meant in their poetry. I mean, one way or another.
Yes, although sometimes it was contentious, like Melville said about Emerson, I do not oscillate in Emerson's rainbow.
Oh, pretty good.
Nay, he says, nay, I do not oscillate in Emerson's rainbow. So, but by the way, I just want to add that Melville, who we all know is a great fiction writer, also wrote a tremendously great book of poems about the Civil War and his being brokenhearted about the Civil War and the promise of America.
I think he wrote a play too, didn't he? Little known.
Maybe, but I don't.
Somebody's thinking of producing it.
Hi, Alice, you're coming back to us.
Here I am. This hour has flown by. I wouldn't have missed this for the world. You all are wonderful. I've had a thoroughly wonderful experience being here tonight, and I know everybody else has too, but I hate to say it, I have to wind it up for the evening, and I'm going to say my goodbyes very slowly, one at a time. Sorry, folks. And nope, let me mute you. I'd like to thank Rose, Ed, and Betsy for participating in Write America this evening, to everyone who tuned in tonight, and to thank you to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to each Monday evening. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Write America. We hope to see you all next week on Monday, October 3rd, as we welcome Bill Naricio and Elaine Pagels. Please remember to check out Bird's Book's Write America page, where you can find out information about our upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you all so much.